I'm Matt Kenyon, and welcome to the Pacenotes, a podcast about all things Porsche. And today we're talking about paint. Today we're going to talk about what we look for in paint when we're looking at cars, customers' cars, or cars that we're going to buy.
There's a number of things that we look at when we're looking at paint, right? We're looking at condition, we're looking at originality, we're looking at the overall quality of the paint. So, when we talk about Porsches, especially vintage Porsches, looking for original paint tends to be first and foremost when we're buying or selling vehicles. There's a number of indicators, right, that we can use to identify whether a paint job, and it's not a perfect science, but whether a paint job is, considered, a factor of paint or not. So we look at thicknesses, we look at condition. There's even texture differences, and all that changes depending on model years too, right?
Yeah, and so depending on what car comes in, what the history is with it, if you're looking at a hot rod, then you're obviously not really looking for original paint all the time. Most of the time those cars have been painted, and you're looking for the quality of the repaint.
Right.
And there's many different ways to look at that, whether it's the thickness of the paint, whether it's defects in the paint. And today we're going to go through a list of kind of the defects, and then kind of the process that you go through.
The tools that we use.
Yeah, and the correct way and incorrect way of painting a car. That's kind of relative depending on who you're talking to.
Sure.
But we've got some examples even right behind us that from original paint to just a repaint to a bare metal respray.
Right.
And a lot of people will say a bare metal respray is the correct way to do it, but it's not always the case. It's not always necessary.
It doesn't fit every project.
And so something like that is you're going a lot further, and that's why people talk about prices in paint jobs, and people are like, oh wow, why does it cost that much? Well, really, the paint is a small part of it. It's the prep, and it's the after, the wet sanding, buffing. So we're going to start going through that process right now. So the basic paint job, when you think of a paint job, I think most people think of, hey, basically just respraying my car. And a lot of people don't really think about, okay, you're disassembling the car, you're sanding down the car. I mean, there's the old Mako way or whatever Earl Scheib way that they just didn't even mask the car.
Paint over it and then wipe off.
And that's one of the big things that I'll look for when I'm looking at a car. If there is paint on the seals and paint on the paint on some of the the frames and all that kind of stuff.
You see overspray everywhere, especially on the undercarriage.
When you see that, you probably are going to just know that the paint in general is not a good paint job. Not just because there's paint on all that stuff, but because if they didn't take the time to take out the windows and to disassemble correctly, then they probably didn't take the time when it came to the sanding, the correct filling, the correct body work. So yeah, that's kind of like but when you think of a paint job, most paint jobs that we see, you don't see too much of that because these are Porsches. People care about their Porsches, but every once in a while you do. And in those cases, there are things you can do to correct the paint job. You can replace the seals, all that kind of stuff. But at the end of the day, you're still going to probably have some issues.
I mean, when we look for originality specifically, we've got our checklist of things, and we kind of mentioned it in one of our episodes when we were talking about, I think it was the Sportomatic. They're looking for originality within cars, and one of the first things we look at would be paint codes, matching up a color to a paint code, a paint tag that's on the inner door jamb of these cars, which you find up until what, 81?
81 was the last year. 82 is the first year of in the trunk, I believe. But yeah, but that kind of stuff is, again, we've been over that before, and it's basically, you can tell what color the car is supposed to be from that and all that. But right now, I think we're going to go dive into more of the quality of, when a car, if a car's color changed or when the car has been repainted, what are fisheyes, what are, some of the imperfections that you can see. So yeah, I mean, I think the first thing when I know a car is coming in that we're inspecting either to buy or when a customer's doing a PPI on a car and they want us to run through the paint, the first thing that I'm going to look through is the measurements on the paint. Obviously, if I go up to the car and can sometimes paint jobs are that bad to where you can tell, hey, there's something going on here. It was obviously repainted.
Right.
But either way, we're going to paint meter that car to know if it was repainted, then how deep is that? You can use a paint meter to see the thickness between basically the paint to the metal.
And early on, wasn't that process they would use a magnet, like in old body shops, they'd use a magnet around, and depending on how strong that magnetic fold was, or if it just fell off, you've got a lot of Bondo. And paint meters are just kind of one step past that. We've got one here, a very handheld digital unit, and they're all based on the same magnetic principle, whether it's electromagnetic or a regular magnetic process. They go through and gauge basically that magnetic strength between the underlayment, the material, so in this case it would be steel, a ferrous metal, and the magnet itself. And so you get a lot better readings out of these digital units. Some measure in micrometers or microns, others in mils.
That's where we differ.
That's where we differ. You go from a buying and selling standpoint, so you deal with numbers. Typically, when we look at Porsche paint, you look at 3 to 5 mils.
Yeah, 3 would be very light. 2, high 2s you'll see every once in a while, but that's like really dangerously thin.
Right.
5 is what people say is the max for original paint, but that's not always true. I've seen over that. I've seen 6s, and it's definitely original paint. It's just certain areas of the car were sprayed heavier than others, like the hood, because they sprayed down on it, versus like the doors and
be really thin.
The fenders. And when you're spraying something like a fender on a car, the paint kind of spreads around it. Where you're spraying the hood, everything kind of just sits.
And is it a metallic paint? Is it?
From what I've seen, metallic paint also tends to measure a little higher. But then again, I've seen thin ones. It also depends on how much detailing has been done to the car. Now, metallic paint for a while was the only silver and the metallic paints were the only ones that did base clear.
Right.
And before it was just single stage, which the difference is single stage is basically just spraying on color. It's
just
all
a single layer of color.
Yeah, and there's no clear over top of it. Where base clear, which is what you see today, more often than not, is base clear.
Right.
And with regulations and everything like that.
Yeah, it's a harder paint, a lot thinner layer of color, but you have a lot thicker when it comes down to and we'll get into correction later, but you have a lot more material to work with, and you're working with a harder layer.
Yeah, and when you're coming down to correction, sometimes it's easier. Some things are easier with base clear, some things are easier to get out with just single stage, because you can kind of go through it. But anyways, we'll go to that later. But yeah, I think to start us off, I'd like to kind of talk about when talking paint. I think a lot of people get confused when they're just paint in general. It's like, okay, how much you spend on the paint job? Okay, like $10,000 or $7,000, $5,000. That's reflected somewhere. It's not just trying to go get the cheapest paint job you can find, because you're going to end up getting a cheap paint job that you're going to have to do later. So a lot of the money you're putting into the prep work. It's the sanding. It's making sure before they even spray or even start going over with filler. And a lot of people use the term Bondo. Bondo is a type of filler. It's a cheap type of filler. So when people say they don't want to see Bondo on cars, I would say that there's probably filler on just about every car out there. Maybe not, but if not, it's thousands and thousands. You're spending
small skim coats is acceptable. It's when it starts getting to a thicker.
There's a certain measurement, and that's when the paint meter really comes in handy. You're measuring that thickness between the clear, the paint, and the filler. The filler is usually taking up the most of it.
Right.
So I think the prep work and the prep work of the paint job is really where. Obviously you want a quality paint job as well. You want to use good paint, but if you don't have good prep, then no matter what paint you're going to use, you're going
to see defects bad. And really, all the time is spent in that prep work. And that's not just from the paint shop and the body shop. Here we send a lot of cars out for paint. We've got one out right now out to paint, and we've got dozens of hours in disassembly and taking out everything that isn't supposed to be painted. So you're taking out you're taking out striker plates and you're taking out door seals, and it keeps growing and growing, especially if you're doing the color change. If you're not changing colors, they call it a scuff and spray, where they just kind of take down the original layers of paint, get down to something that's really going to stick, not be too thick, and then they can respray it.
And that's acceptable. And a lot of people say like, think that you have to do bare metal respray. No, from what I've seen, what I've heard, and from what we've done here, a car that's never been repainted before, original paint, I mean, a lot of people would say don't paint it, but at the same time, if you want to repaint original paint, it's actually not a bad thing to paint over, because it's been on that car for so long that it's it's a good base to kind of spray over. And as long as you're not, as long as they're doing the body work correctly, where they can get some of the dents and whatever out to a certain point, and they can only use a certain amount of filler, then it's actually a good call to do just a respray over or something like that. But if you're talking 2, 3, 4 resprays and never taking the thing down to bare metal, then yes, that's...
Yeah. Paint will start cracking and you have no idea what's underneath. You can only go so thick before...
And there's that question on cars, how thick do you want the paint to be? Or how thick, for a respray, how thick is acceptable? Again, it's gonna be based off the prep work and all that kind of stuff, because I've seen, good repaints be a little thicker, and it's not a problem. It's like when you get to a point where it's so thick, you're going to tell before you're going to have any issues. So one of the things that you see with cars that have too much filler on it, you'll start to see cracking. When you use too much filler on a car, you start to see lines kind of underneath the paint start to form. And it's kind of, it looks as if it's a little bump in, which it kind of is, because too much filler is not going to hold up for too long, and eventually it will crack.
With heat, expansion, just a moving vehicle itself, and you're gonna see a crack.
Yeah, and a lot of that stuff you'll see, if you don't see it within the first year, it's probably going to take a while, but because a lot of that will happen right after, because after the curing stage and after sitting for a while, they usually, after you get a paint job, they say, hey, before you don't get a detail for like 3 months, because they don't want all the uncured, because there is stuff on the car that's still uncured.
Sure. And when people say, I don't want any filler, it's almost impossible to do these cars without filler. They used filler from the factory, but it was lead, right? So clearly, you're not going to find many shops, if any, that are going to go through and they kind of make lead into a butter, and then they smear it around. It's really dangerous, and it's not very fun. And so when you take these down for a bare metal restoration like we do, there is a need for filler. You're going to have gaps. You're going to have areas that need to be thinly spread. I mean, we're talking, microns.
Yeah, they're going to get the metal. They're going to do the body work to get the metal up to an acceptable point, and then from there it'll be a skim coat.
And that's where all that time comes in for paint prep. Like I said, you can get somebody to come out and spray a car for a couple thousand. Not a big deal. But you're not really going to like the results. And, unless you have just a driver car and you're not too worried about being too showy. But
and then there's the other end of the spectrum where it's like, okay, what point is overboard? And
you can
that
have
depends on what car you're
$40,000, $50,000, $60,000 paint jobs. And, when you talk about thickness of paint, some people want to spray a little thicker too. Or if you're doing a clear coat, they want a lot of clear. They want super
Which
reflective.
isn't a bad thing, because the clear is not going to mess the paint up. Depending on, as long as they spray it in good condition.
Use a quality material. We tend to like to use glycerate, sickens, depending on the color and the formula. There's always questions on whether or not to go single stage or base clear.
That's just...
And there's no hard and swift answer on that. These cars, up until the 993s, up until 98, they use single stage on their non-metallic colors. Metallic is always
and base clear is
clear coat.
It's great as well.
It's a hard paint. The paint is sealed, and it comes with, both have their pros and cons. Single stage, I would say at this point, because I have an older car that we repainted. It was a 67, and we decided to go with base clear because it is a harder paint. The paint is sealed with that clear coat. With single stage, it's porous.
You'll see a lot of people who want to go single stage, or the people who are storing a very original car or something that's
Right.
a very rare car,
Right.
very
Originality is important
yes.
in that case.
And in those cases, it's good to do that. I guess besides that, it's just a preference.
Right. For us, we can easily tell in a car, like you said, up until 98, they were using single stage on their non-metallic colors and obviously base clear for metallics. And so you can go through with your finger a little bit of compound on the car and you can see you've got a solid color, non-metallic. One thing that you also find different between different paints is going to be whether or not it was petroleum-based or if it's water-based. Factories, I think it was in the 90s, so Porsche switched over to water-based. California, you can't even find shop that are petroleum-based. And if they do, it's a very, very limited quantity. I think they can do like 25 gallons or
There's a lot of
something.
people out here that ship their car to Oregon.
Yeah, and they ship it to Arizona and get it painted. And, there's different schools of thought on that. Some people think petroleum is more malleable and, doesn't crack as much or, it hardens. But we go with what we're allowed to paint here, and we haven't had a problem with our water-based paints.
No, and I like the fact that you can, and I guess you can do this with single stage too. After they're done, a paint job, you don't just spray it and you're done. You spray it and then you wet sand above,
Right.
and that's how you get that finished product to be flat. Instead of seeing orange peel, which is what you call that, when there's little. What would you call those? Orange.
See, you get small fish eyes, you get small drips. There's a number of defects that you can end up seeing depending on the preparation of paint. Right? You get, and even if it's a new job or an old job. So, like blistering is one of the big things we see on cars that are 40, 50 years old. And that's that separation of material where like moisture or trap gases have gotten in between, either paint, primer, and that separates, and starts to lift off the actual panel.
And that's not fixable.
Not much you can do about that.
With paint, there's always something. I don't think there's such thing as a perfect paint job. I think most people would agree. It's just how much do you want to spend on prep work and paint and buffing and all that.
Right.
But at the end of the day, it's whatever the person wants, whatever the customer wants, whatever. It's a relative thing.
Right. So the things we do see on these is chalking, which it's interesting. You see it on some cars and not others, and that's where it's environmental based, where there's been a lot of UV damage, and the binding agents of the paint itself have started to kind of decompose a bit, and
It's the start of failure.
Yeah, you can buff it and it looks great, and then 2 or 3 weeks later, it'll just look faded in that one area, and it's that color you're starting to lift. One thing about single stage is I mentioned before, it's a permeable solid, so it has oils, and just like skin or leather, if you don't condition it, it'll start to crack and it'll start to degrade, which a lot of people like base clear for that reason.
Yep.
It doesn't do that because it's sealed. It's got that clear coat on it. So, you get things like chopping.
It can with the base clear, you'll start to see the paint failure on the clear coat if it's out.
Yeah, the clear will start to burn out, and you see that in a lot of cars.
Yeah, you'll see. Arizona or even California. Sometimes it's or any state really.
Right.
It's hot.
The roof just
It's
burns
just
off.
sun fade. Yeah, it basically burn through the clear, and there's no coming back.
Right. Yeah, and then it's just a general lack of, I guess, called paint abuse.
Yeah.
Where you just, if you don't care,
We're detailing the car, and so it's age, and some paints, like I think there were some manufacturers that had an issue with that, and some car companies have been gone into lawsuits over that kind of stuff. So sometimes it's the quality of the paint also, because some paint will last longer, but eventually if you don't take care of your paint and do paint corrections and when they're needed, then you're going to eventually see that on your car.
Right. Really common things we see on this, we see fish eyes. Generally, those get sanded out. You see a lot of times on new paint where there's just a contaminant, whether it's a fingerprint or some oil that's on the panel itself. It gets sprayed, and the paint just doesn't adhere.
Yeah.
You know, it's like having oil and water together. They repel each other, and it comes up like, looks like a bubble that's popped, just a little crater. And it's one of those post activities that they do after the car's been painted. They go through and they'll wet sand it and knock those things down. Some of the drips.
A lot of that stuff can be taken down, as long as it's not underneath the clear.
Right.
So yeah, I mean, we've got paint jobs here where there's little things like that, but as long as they can be buffed out,
we can take them out afterwards.
I would say that's probably in most paint jobs, and it's just because to try when you go to paint a car, and the reason they have a paint booth is they try to keep it as clean as possible, dust free as possible, because they're spraying pressurized paint, the pressure out of a pressurized gun.
Right.
So it's blowing anything around it up. So most paint shops do their best to keep any dust or anything out of there, but it's almost impossible to keep everything out of there.
It can't be a clean room. They're not walking around. Well, they do have suits, but it's it's not a typical clean room. There's a number of defects there we can run through, but I really want to go over what we really look for when we're looking at paint, whether it's original paint or not. What are the basic considerations we look at when we're looking at paint, whether it's original or respray, is variation. So, we can read a panel on a car, and based on the variation of panels throughout the car, identify whether it's too thick, too thin. That will tell us whether it's original, whether it's a respray, is it a quality respray, or is this a bare metal restoration that may have been laid on a little bit thicker than the factory would. So we've got a couple of examples behind us, kind of going in order with the 73 Raspberry. That's original paint job. What would you say that reads out as?
Anywhere between high 3s and 5, maybe.
Yeah,
in certain areas.
3 to 5 mils is in the micron world is 80 to 120. Detailers tend to use microns because there's the numbers larger, so we can, when we detail a car, we can see just how much material we're losing. And so you say about 3 to 5 mils. Then we get to a car like this. So this is a 72 that was originally an Abergine, that was a respray. And I think it's probably had a couple paint jobs in its life.
Oh yeah.
And how thick would you say this is?
This one, it's not, and this is one of the reasons why people like to see consistency when they're looking for original paint, because obviously on a original paint car, there's not really any body damage, so it should be very consistent. Where this car, it's been resprayed, it's been through a few paint jobs. It's had filler on it in different spots. So this one I've seen from 12 to almost 30.
Right.
Which again, that's not like the paint's going to fail. It's higher. It's higher than you'd like to see.
Right.
And it's if you were to go and repaint this car, and then you definitely want to take it down to bare metal, because at that point you're just going to stack onto that. Eventually, that new paint job that you put in the car is going to fail as well.
Right. And your newest paint job can only be as good as the paint job before it. So at a certain point, you're you're in for a penny.
And we've dealt with it before with cars that we repainted, and it was, I think, the second repaint. The customer wanted to repaint the car but didn't want to take it down to bare metal, and that's where we told him, hey, that's fine, but you got to know that anything under that paint could affect the new paint job. So, and that's why it's always maybe not. Usually on a second, you can repaint the car twice, but there's just more things that can happen.
On a scuff and spray, you're hopefully trying to get enough rough surface on the original paint job to be able to get that new coat to stick. But once you start getting 2 or 3, you can't really get down to those levels. If you are, then we'll just take it down to bare metal.
And most people are okay with taking the car down to bare metal, or doing what it takes to make the car right. Sometimes there's certain panels that hey, we got to take this certain panel down to bare metal, but these other panels are okay.
Right.
So, and I mean, you're also talking about 30, 40, 50-year-old cars. They've been through a lot. If they haven't been taken down to bare metal, most of them, it's hard to find a 70s car or even an 80s car that hasn't been resprayed.
Right.
So.
And we have our third example, 76 Turbo. And this is a full restoration, right? Down to bare metal, full restoration, complete respray. And what would you say to it?
I think the highest point's 15 on that.
Yeah.
So anywhere from, I think there's like 5 to 15 on that, which is
it's a base clear, it's a metallic.
For a car that was even taken down to bare metal.
Right.
Because our painters, we do like to have them use a lot of clear, so that they can buff it and make it look nice and flat. But at the same time, it shows that there's not too much body. There's not too much body work that needed to happen to it.
Right.
So yeah, and I think that's one of the big things when you're looking at a paint job. When you use a paint meter, if you're not using it for a original paint car, you're looking to see if the car's been hit before, and damaged before, all that kind of stuff.
And that's those variations you start to see, right? Where if it's too low, you realize that maybe it is original paint, but it's just been overcorrected, and you're about to hit primer. If it's high, but not very high, like you said, like this car, it's got a few paint jobs on it, but probably no body damage.
Probably shouldn't repaint it again.
Right. And they're extremely high, and sometimes it won't even read. You're at the point where there's just too much filler, and there's something wrong.
Yeah, and I think, and people always ask, okay, what's too high? I'm not even going to put a number out there because it also depends on the quality of what it was done, and the quality of the products that they used on the car. So, obviously, if the paint meter can't read it, it's too high. But I've seen cars with 30s and 35, and they're not having an issue that had an issue, and it was probably quality products that they used.
Sure. I get a little concerned if it gets above that.
Yeah, I mean, I don't even like to see 30 to 35, but at the same time, it's like it's
a driver car.
It's a car that guy's like, hey, it was painted 20 years ago, and it's at 30, 35. Most likely, it's not going to fail now.
Sure. We actually have a fender here. We can use this as an example, where we've got a good amount of filler in one particular area, and then we got some other areas that are really thin. And at this stage, we're just going to dub over it. We can see, we get further back here, so you find areas that are. So if we go away from the filler, we get to 18, 26. And as we start approaching that filler, see 59, 55, and now it won't read.
Because this was cut off of a car, you can actually see.
So if you look at the profile here,
you can see kind of what those measurements are. So, you can see when it gets too high. But, after looking at how much, 20 really is or 30 really is, it's like, okay, wow, that's really doesn't look like that much filler. So it really shows, on a paint job that's measuring at 10 or 20, like, I don't even think the human eye would really even be able to see that.
Right. And you look at the other side where that filler's at, and you can see that there's a seam, and so they've done either a panel replacement or a partial panel replacement, and that's what we call clipping in the industry. So that's where they've, and this is not that uncommon. Either they've changed flares.
You'd like to see it better than that.
Well, yeah, this is not very good butt weld, if it even is. This is typically a good area that rusts out, so people will replace this portion of the quarter, but you'll see entire front ends that are clipped.
And people, a lot of the cars, the cars that we restored here, you see things like this. There's a reason people are restoring them, because they're not in good shape to start out.
But these weren't always valuable cars.
So there is, when you go down to a bare metal respray, sometimes you do even measure out a little thicker than 10 to 15 because of things like that. A car that's been hit before, or if you're restoring a car that's been hit before, so there is going to have to be some welding in there. Right. So you're going to have to use some type of filler. It's going to be a little higher, but You just try to get it as small as thin as you can.
Especially with these cars. I mean, find one of these that hasn't been whipped around into a tree. The quarters on these cars are always filled with something, especially at 930.
Yeah.
An early turbo, good luck.
When I go look at cars, I'm always looking at the corners, and then all four corners, and that's basically the main part where you will see if the car has been hit, you're going to see it be thicker in that area.
And there's also environment too, right? So is it coming from a northern climate? So they salt the roads, you start looking at floor pans, the horseshoe, the edge of the doors, and you'll see common rust areas. Versus we're in a coastal area in San Diego, and so you'll see a lot of that ocean spray. So you'll see it up a little bit higher.
And when you do see, a lot of people, most people know this, that when, I wouldn't say most people, but a lot of car guys know that when you see bubbling on the paint, coming from underneath the paint, that's separation, but usually it's separation because there's rust underneath it. It's been corroded, and the paint's basically just not adhering anymore.
Right. You could typically take an awl or a flathead screwdriver and just poke through it, and then you just see the material behind it crumble. But I mean, these cars, they weren't galvanized until 77, 78. So to find a roast-free long head, good luck.
Well, this is 76 and a half is when they did the galvanizing. And so this one was actually galvanized, but if you have an earlier 76, they could have had a rust. But what you'll notice on a lot of these cars is underneath them, 72 and 73 cars are usually better with floor pans and stuff because the bottoms of the cars were galvanized, but not the tops. The pans. But again, it's not as great as the 80s cars and stuff like that. But you will, from what I've seen, 72, 73 and up is better than 69, 77.
Sure. Short wheelbase cars, there's just not a lot of undercoating at all, so they will just turn the cheese.
So and then after the paint job, after probably years down the road, or there are cars that have good paint jobs on them, but they just they see swirls, they see and different colors show it more. Right.
You take care of your paint.
Yeah.
Especially single stage. How do you bring these 40, 50-year-old paint jobs back to life? And there's no easy way to answer that.
Necessary.
I mean, it really comes down to the type of paint, the formula of the paint. What color is it? Is it a metallic? Is it a non-metallic? Is it glazurate? How has the paint been? How's the car been stored? What environmentals? Heavy UV damage. So the first thing whenever we get a car in for paint restoration or correction is we just look at how the paint's been handled, taken care of, and so we have to use, it's really a combination of different buffers. So whether, typically we use the same DA, but we've got a variety of throws and a variety of types depending on what the area is like. And your pads, whether you use microfibers or foams, and your compounds. And I mean, the real meat of it's in the compounds, which you can consider to be it's a liquid abrasive.
Very, very thin.
Right. And they've got different micro abrasives in them that either break down or don't break down. Your heavier ones that you're really doing, more aggressive paint correction, trying to get out scratches and just 50 years of grime, you're using a grittier.
And with those, compound. You're basically, with the heavier abrasives, you're digging down into, which digging down sounds very
right, but we're talking
but you're
microns.
Digging down into where that scratch, the little tiny scratches are, and you're digging down to the point so it's all.
You consider it a valley, and just how much of that valley, the edges, are you trying to edge them down? Are you trying to get rid of it completely?
And this is why you use a paint meter, because you're digging into the paint, so you want to know how thin you can really go before you've got to really be careful. And there's those times where they are scratches and they may just be in the clear, but it's just not worth it to go on.
Right. Yeah, a good detailer will get measurements as before they start using compound and as they're doing it, so they can see they're shaving off how many microns, and you keep going. And there is that point of diminishing returns where a scratch is so deep, even if it's in the clear, to where to lower it down, you'd have to get too much of the surrounding area to be compromised. So in those cases, if you get down past the clear and into the paint, that's when you fill it, raise it up to the level of everything else, and then try and minimize the look of it. But it's not just scratches. It's, first off, when you bring in the car, typically it's just got contaminants just from being out on the road, and just being in the environment.
That's where you can feel it. It's got.
Yeah, you can take your fingers over it. One of the tricks is to put your hand in a plastic bag and drag over it, and if it grabs, it's definitely not clean. Obviously, wash the car first, but clay bar is the first thing I like to do.
Yeah.
And
the clay bar, for those who don't know, it takes the dirt and everything that's been sitting on that car and kind of stuck to the car. It takes it off in a safe way.
Yeah, it's a synthetic compound, and you use some sort of lubricant. Usually like a quick detail spray, something like that, so it doesn't just stick to the paint.
The clay you kind of flip as you go. Once you see it dirty,
make a little pancake. And just keep moving it around, and you can just see it pick up everything. You don't have to use those. You can use compound to get that stuff off, but it takes a lot longer, and all that turns into dust when you use compound, and it'll just fly everywhere. It's easier to clay it first.
Start on a clayed car.
Exactly, and then you start off with your paint correction compound. And then it just depends where you go from there. Depends on the level of detail you're doing, the level of correction, and how the paint takes it. Because there's some compounds I can use on a black car that I can't use on this raspberry car.
And that's purely because certain colors show it.
Right. Or maybe it's hot that day and this one just likes to bind too quickly.
Yeah, and that's going to be the brand of the paint, how it's cured, and all that stuff. So,
but traditionally, it's you do a clay bar process, move on to a correction process, polish, and then what you do from there, I think, also depends on the type of paint. So whether or not, usually with base clear, it's a hardened paint. It's got that clear coat over it. You don't need to do much else to it.
A finishing polish.
Yeah,
is
you don't need.
a wax.
I personally don't use waxes on base clears.
Yeah.
Now, single stage is a different story.
Certainly. Yeah.
That's the one that's permeable, and it kind of breathes, so it can take in oils and it can release oils. And we've had some cars that are so old that, and we mentioned before, they start to chalk. It starts to release those binding agents, and the color starts disappearing. So you can get like a glazing type product that gets some of those oils back into the paint, much like you do with a leather conditioner. You let that sit overnight, and you see it just disappears. The paint, you can suck those oils back in, let it sit, and then you cover it up with a sealer or a wax for single stage. So there's these different care techniques depending on the type of paint that you have. Some of the things that just when we're doing a quick detail job on a car, people typically see scratches, but they don't really notice the difference when you have swirl marks and haloing and water spots.
Yeah, there's a difference between detailing. You tell someone that you spent $1,000 on detail, they're gonna be like, "Dude, you're nuts." But when it comes to a car that's just been sitting for a while, hasn't had much, has a lot of swirl marks, it takes a lot to get that back.
Oh yeah.
And a lot of just quick detail shops, they can definitely make it look better really quick. But then the next week you're going back to them.
Right.
It's not a fix. And so you see people use, the sealant that they put on after they detail the car. They put what's it called?
I don't know.
It's a sealant. It's not the
No.
One of those. You guys know?
It's a ceramic coat.
Ceramic coat. Yeah. So you see people use ceramic coats on cars to protect it, and there's some people say it's worth it. Some people say it's not.
Yeah.
It is a tiny layer that you're putting on your car, but
it's very thin. We're talking 1 or 2 microns.
It's basically another clear coat that's not as tough as a clear
It's
coat.
a hydrophobic. So a lot of the companies make claims that it'll protect from light scratches and things like that. It really just makes it easier to wash your car. You can spray water on it and it beads. It's like Rain-X.
If you really want to protect a car, clear bra is usually the
you just do film. Film ranges, in the 5 to 8 mils, which is thick. And even actually the 76 Turbo has it. So, and you can actually read difference in thickness between panels that have it and that don't, and it self heals. So when people spend thousands on ceramic coat, it sounds neat, but just go get the front clear wrapped and call it a day, be done with it.
But yeah,
I mean, you see a number of cars that we've got actually have some of these defects, and this is what we'll cut away. Now you can see this. We've got a lot of micro swirls. We've got some haloing, where someone's kind of spun a microfiber in circles. A couple spots here that look like rain spots, maybe even contaminants have just kind of sat on the paint and have eaten through the first couple layers of single stage. But it's a single stage paint, so
micro scratches.
It'll shed off. There's no clear dap to really work with.
And one of the questions I have, how deep can you go with a scratch before it's not able to fix?
You can usually see it. You can see once you've gone through it clear and into paint. And if you got into primer, even if you get into paint, you need to fill it because you're just way too close to primer and bare metal itself. So it's not worth chasing after that scratch. You see on this car, the 74 Carrera, we've done a 50-50 on it. It's not here right now. We've done a 50-50 on it. One side we've detailed, the other side we haven't. And you can see a number of those little micro scratches and various imperfections that we corrected. So yeah, there's a number of considerations that when we look at paint, whether we're buying or selling, or if it's a customer's car, and we're looking at restoring the paint. It's part of our pre-purchase inspection process. It's also one of the services that we provide here, so we also do detailing service.
So if any of you guys have any questions with any of this, or want any info from us, more info on your paint job, if you would like us to inspect the car, or it's tough to do it through photos, but if you could bring the car into us, we could do an inspection for you. Have any questions, call us, click the link below, and thank you for watching the Pacenotes.